Greetings, humans of the internet. Welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your excellent host, Luke Johnson, coming to you as usual from my undisclosed location in Midwest USA with some historical insight on this week's topic, firefighters. Because I thought this would be a good time to recognize civil servants. If you can't take the heat, then get out of the kitchen and log off right now because here we go. Now, as in most cases, before we can really look at American history, we have to look at pre-American history. And the first recorded attempts to control fires took place around 300 BC in Rome, when firefighting duties and night watch services were done by a band of slaves called the Familia Publica, or public household, and they in turn were supervised by a committee of citizens. And during the reign of Augustus Caesar, Rome developed what might be considered the first municipal type fire department by organizing these slaves and citizens into a corps of vigils. And the corps of vigils represents the first organized form of fire protection. Night patrolling and night watch forces were its principal services. In addition, each of the vigils was assigned to a particular task during a fire. For example, some members of the brigade called a quarry carried water to the fire scene in jars, and later aqueducts were built to carry water around the city, and hand pumps were developed to help get the water to the fire. And the earliest recorded fire chief during the time of the Roman Empire, leather hoses came in to use, and large pillows were carried to the scene so people could jump from tall buildings. And this now brings us to fire protection in colonial America. Night fire watches were instituted in the larger cities of America during colonial times. In 1654, in Boston, Massachusetts, a bellman was put to work from 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. These volunteers were nicknamed the Rattle Watch because of the large rattles used to sound alarms. The Night Fire Watch Service was a community institution before there were municipal police forces. As a result of a disastrous fire in Boston in 1631, the first fire ordinance in America was adopted, and it prohibited thatched roofs and wooden chimneys, for obvious reasons. Another large fire broke out in Boston in 1679, which led to the organization of the first paid fire department in North America, if not the entire world. Boston Selectmen, as they were called, imported a horse wagon from England and employed a fire chief named Thomas Atkins and 12 firefighters to operate. And in colonial American communities, each homeowner was required to keep 2 buckets on hand. When church bells rang to report a fire, people formed lines to pass water from wells or springs to the fire. And when horse-drawn water pumps were introduced, companies were organized to operate engines, but citizens still were required to respond with buckets of water to fill the pumps. And these precautions might have started because in 1666, London, England suffered catastrophic fire. The only equipment available to fight the London fire consisted of 2 quart hand syringes and a similar, slightly larger syringe. The fire burned for 4 days. The London fire stimulated the development of a 2-person operated pump on wheels. And around 1672, leather hoses and couplings for joining lengths together were produced, though the leather hoses had to be sewn like a fine boot. Fabric and rubber-treated hose did not become common, and fabric and rubber-treated hoses would not come into use until the 1870s. And if I did not say so before, the first American fire company in colonial America was actually paid. The volunteer fire department would not come along until sometime later. It was in 1736 when a man in Philadelphia named Benjamin Franklin, yes, that Benjamin Franklin, to make firefighting companies. And soon 6 volunteer fire departments were established in Philadelphia. And in 1752, insurance companies in the colonies began issuing plaques for fire marks to be prominently displayed on building fronts as an incentive for volunteer firefighters to save their insured building. And these fire marks are extremely rare today, as most of them were made of lead and were melted down to make ammunition during the Revolutionary War. With bonuses offered as incentives, rivalries ensued between groups. Marked homes and businesses were often fought over, while residences on the same street with no fire mark often burned to the ground. Seems as though they were kind of biased, and I'm sure that burned a lot of people up. Sorry, folks, I had to do that. I got dad jokes for days, y'all. For days. And around this time, we began to see festive events like firemen's balls pop up. One festive occasion was the annual town parade, where each party dressed in colorful uniforms would march down Main Street. And here, too, companies sought to outdo each other. Lavish helmets and uniforms, fancy fire axes, decorative parade torches, hand-painted stovepipe-shaped fire hats, fancy painted fire buckets, and engraved silver speaking trumpets were commissioned for these parades. And the speaking trumpets were sometimes used for salting insults at rival fire brigades. If they had a hand pumper, it was decorated too, often by celebrated artists. A horse-drawn fire engine was built in London, England in 1829. However, volunteer fire companies of the day were very slow to accept it. Perhaps they were afraid of the boiler exploding. And when a group of insurance companies in New York had a self-propelled fire engine built in 1841, the firefighters were so afraid of its use that the insurance companies gave up the project. That would all change in 1852. On March 2nd of that year, three Cincinnati men, Abel Schock, Alexander Bonner Latta, and Miles Greenwood, began construction of the world's first practical steam-powered fire engine. The three men definitely knew what they were doing. Schock was a locksmith, Latta was a locomotive builder, and Greenwood's Eagle Iron Works manufactured the engines. Earlier inventors had manufactured steam-powered fire engines, but the Cincinnati version proved to be much more practical, as the steam engine could begin pumping water out of a water source in just 10 minutes. Earlier engines took much longer. And after the three men demonstrated their finished engine to the Cincinnati City Council, the council members contracted them for an engine. The fire engine was presented to the Cincinnati Fire Department on January the 1st, 1853, making Cincinnati the first place in the world to use steam fire engines. And the first engine was nicknamed Uncle Joe Ross, after a city council member. And in 1853, April the 1st, Cincinnati, Ohio established the first professional and fully paid fire department in the United States. And in 1854, Cincinnati residents raised enough funds to allow the fire department to buy a second steam fire engine. And this one was called the Citizen's Gift, for obvious reasons. And this was just one of several technological advances in fire departments during this time. In 1852, a doctor in Boston named William F. Channing used telegraph technology developed in the early 1840s to create the first fire alarm box system. Later that year, Boston had fire alarm boxes all over the city. The first box was struck on April the 29th of 1852. And I'm sure, as some of you know, before the days of self-propelled fire engines, fire departments relied on horses. In 1832, the New York Mutual Hook and Ladder Company, number 1 volunteers purchased a horse to pull their pumps. One of the reasons may have been due to a shortage of firefighters caused by a yellow fever epidemic. It may have been simply that they were tired of pulling the heavy apparatus themselves. The latter seems more likely to me. Regardless of the reasons, the idea caught on fast, and before long, horses became a loved symbol of fire departments all over the country. The horses were often trained to the sound of the bell to get out of their stalls and stand at the front of the apparatus, usually with help of another popular symbol of the fire department, which is still popular to this day, the Dalmatian. Dalmatians were first chosen as fire dogs because they formed a strong bond with the horses. They guarded the valuable horses and kept them company in the station. Often, at the sound of the bell, the Dalmatian would rouse the horses and then run out to the apron to bark at the people trying to cross in front of the house. They would then chase the fire apparatus to the scene to alert people. The end of Dalmatians as a coaching dog for fire departments happened around the advent and the introduction of motorized cars and fire engines. However, they are still on duty in many fire stations today, acting as companions to the firefighters and watchdogs to protect the equipment. And interestingly, the horses used to pull the heavy fire engines in Boston suffered from equine influenza, which resulted in the Great Fire of Boston in 1872. The firefighters had to struggle to pull the heavy steamers themselves through the narrow, winding streets of Boston to the fire. It is reported that the fire assumed fearful proportions within 15 minutes of being detected. 13 people were killed, 9 of them were firefighters. Not long after, steam-powered and then gasoline-powered firefighting apparatus were put into service. And this now brings us to the mechanization of fire departments. Gasoline engines were first used either as pumping engines or as tractors to pull heavy apparatus. And in 1910, the two functions were combined. One engine both propelling the truck and driving the pump. Modern equipment is usually diesel-powered, and multiple variations of the basic fire engine enable firefighters to respond to many types of emergency situations. We're thankful there are, aren't we, folks? However, that is not to say that many fire departments quickly adapted to this technology. In 1923, on a Monday morning in Chicago on February 6th, fire alarm 846 at the intersection of State and Chicago Avenue was pulled at 12:40 p.m. with the horses scrubbed and groomed and the old steam wagon rolled out of the swinging doors at Fire Engine 11 for the last time. The fire company's horses, Buck, Beauty, Dan, and Teddy, galloped out of the fire station at 10 East Hubbard Street with their coach and the firefighters riding on the engine. They were led by their Dalmatian escort to a false alarm, and this would be their last response. The alarm was pulled at a box at Chicago Avenue and State Street as part of a planned event to mark the retirement of the horse-drawn engines and firefighting equipment in the city of Chicago. It was the first department in the United States with more than 500,000 residents to become completely motorized. And personally, I'd like to thank all the brave men and women who helped put out fires. You're doing God's work, that's for sure. And I dedicate this episode to them. And with that, this has been Bowtie Talks. Goodbye, and God bless.